We have two rapporteurs here. First of all, Mr. Pascu, as far as the implementation of a common security and defense policy. The two rapporteurs will begin, first of all, with Mr. McAllister. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Madam High Representative, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, with this year's annual report on the common foreign and security policy, we have identified the major issues our Union faces, and we also outline possible ways forward. The EU security environment is today more volatile, more unpredictable, more complex and more ambiguous than at any time since the end of the Cold War. We have often heard the High Representative telling us about this in this plenary. We all know that we are confronted with a number of interstate conflicts, also in our immediate neighbourhood, with terrorism, failed states, cyber attacks and hybrid warfare. The European Union has a growing responsibility to safeguard its own security, while on the other hand defending its interests and values in the world. The time indeed has come for the EU to take its destiny into its own hands and embrace its role as a fully fledged, sovereign, political and economic power in international relations. Colleagues, we all know no single EU member state can respond effectively to today's global challenges on its own. We must continue to promote our European values while staying committed to multilateralism, a rule-based international order and economic cooperation. I would like to highlight two very important aspects that should shape the EU's foreign policy in the future. The first aspect is the so-called integrated approach to external conflicts and crises as a framework for a more coherent and holistic engagement by the EU. The European Union is a major player when it comes to diplomacy, trade, development cooperation, humanitarian aid and, step by step, also in the field of security and defence. But our Union should act strategically by using its wide array of policies and instruments to respond to the challenges in our direct neighbourhood and beyond. The second aspect concerns the effectiveness of the EU's decision-making process in foreign policy. As a Union, I believe we should be able to reach positions by qualified majority voting in the Council. The need for unanimity keeps us from being able to act credibly on the global stage. Would this entail amendments to the treaty? I believe no, because Article 31 of the treaty already allows the European Council to determine which decisions may in the future be taken by a qualified majority. Colleagues, as this is a joint debate on both reports, a short remark on the European Union's security and defence policy by my colleague Pascu. Soft power and institution building alone cannot be sufficient to exert influence in a world where power politics is increasingly significant. The effectiveness of the EU's foreign policy will depend on an adequate combination of soft and hard power tools. And looking to the left of the plenary, becoming a credible hard power doesn't mean to militarise the European Union. We should rather become more autonomous and live up to our global responsibilities. Yes, Federica Mogherini, the European Union's common security and defence policy is on track. PESCO has been launched to strengthen our security and defence, with 25 member states participating. Moreover, the European Commission has proposed a €13 billion European Defence Fund for the years 2021 till 2027 to increase our strategic autonomy, to bolster our ability to protect our citizens and to make the EU a stronger global actor. With today's debate and tomorrow's vote on the EDF, this Parliament can send out a strong signal in support of the fund. Finally, I would like to thank my shadow rapporteurs for the good and fruitful cooperation. It was and is a pleasure to witness that at least the larger political groups in this House act in concert towards a stronger common foreign and security policy of our Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McAllister. The floor now goes for 4 minutes to Mr. Pascu.
Madam High Representative, I think you know that the world order is over. The one post the Second World War is ending. We are confronted with systemic challenges in which multilateralism tends to be substituted by unilateralism, free trade by protectionism, solidarity by self-interest. And the problem is that the kind of global challenges we stand confronted with require global answers which are difficult to get in an increasingly fragmented international system. The report is starting with this strategic environment, an analysis of the strategic environment, and underlines the importance of the transatlantic bond. And I think you know that here it's an appeal to everybody to try to preserve the functioning of the transatlantic bond, trying to separate the influences coming from the commercial area into the security area. We also mention the recent activities and policies of Russia, which have reduced stability and changed the security environment. In all this picture, common security and defence policy is one of the useful tools for addressing many of these challenges. It would be used more efficiently and in coherence with other external and internal instruments. The security of EU member states is deeply interconnected, and the need for cooperation, although recognized, requires more to be done in that respect. CSDP is reflecting an increased investment in security and defence as a matter of urgency, as it is requested in the global strategy. And we are asking, to look seriously for the 2% which to be allotted from the GDP for defence. We welcome the creation of a dedicated heading for defence in the Commission's multiannual financial framework proposal, and in particular the establishment of a budget line from which the European Defence Fund and military mobility projects should be funded. This will require also an essential development of a well-defined overarching strategic approach to European defence, and here we reiterate our call for a EU security and defence white book. With respect to the capabilities of the unions, we underline, like our colleagues, the EU needs to apply the entire toolbox of available policy instruments, from soft to hard power and from short-term measures to long-term policies, developing the necessary civilian and military capabilities as outlined in the global strategy. We consider that the EU member states must endeavour to improve military capabilities to cover the full spectrum of land, air, space, maritime and cyber capabilities, including strategic enablers to make the EU CSDP a credible force. In this respect, we recognise the strategic dimension of the space sector, and we encourage movement in that respect. We consider that the capabilities of the Union's security and defence could be improved by making better use of the existing frameworks of defence and military cooperation, such as the European Multinational High Readiness Corps headquarters and the EU battle groups, reinforcing and not duplicating similar initiatives with NATO. And we are asking for the transformation of national armed forces into forces more interoperable, more sustainable, more flexible and more deployable. I would conclude by saying that we support the array of missions which are undertaken already, and we also ask for a parliamentary oversight of an increasing attention paid to security and defence.
Thank you very much, colleague Pascu. And now the floor goes to the Vice President of the Commission and High Representative, Commissioner Mogherini. Madam Mogherini, please.
Here, Mr. President.
Okay.
This is a debate I take as a High Representative, so this is the right side of the hemicycle. Let me start by thanking David McAllister and Ioan Pascu for their excellent work. Looking at your reports, I see very clearly a shared understanding of our world and of our joint place in this world as Europeans. I think we all agree that no single European country can respond effectively to any of the challenges of our times, And I think we agree that we, the European Union, have a responsibility to embrace our role as a global power, working together for peace, security and human development worldwide, and in some cases even filling a gap. And yet I think we have an interest in doing so, because together we have unparalleled leverage in shaping global rules, peace processes or trade agreements. Let me say this very clearly. I believe there is no contradiction at all between European interests and national interests, in particular in this field. The European Union is the most powerful instrument we have as Europeans to serve our national interests on the global scene. None of our member states is big enough in the world of today to pursue their own national interests all alone. And this is why some in the world might cherish divisions among us. It might be in their interest, but never in ours. Likewise, there is no contradiction between our support for multilateralism and the work to advance our European and national interests. We know from experience that our national and collective interests are best served through multilateral institutions, and the European Union is in itself the most successful multilateral institution that was ever built. We need multilateral institutions to promote rights, to protect the environment, to govern globalization. We need multilateral institutions to build peace and security worldwide. We couldn't do this without them in our multipolar, disordered world. When we join forces as Europeans and take part in global negotiations, we are not giving up on our sovereignty. On the contrary, we are exerting our sovereignty more fully, more powerfully on the global stage. This is why we have chosen the United Nations as our fundamental partner. We are the first economic contributor to the UN system, and we support Guterres' work to reform the UN system and make it more effective. We are also exploring new ways of working together, for instance by ensuring full complementarity and compatibility between all our new projects on the ground. Our foreign policy is cooperative by definition. The McAllister report rightly points out that the transatlantic partnership remains indispensable for Europe, for America and for the rest of the world. In spite of substantial disagreements with the current administration on certain issues, we continue to work together on the great majority of issues, from Ukraine to Afghanistan, from the Balkans to North Korea. In these years, we have also deepened our cooperation with other traditional partners. African Union, our cooperation with them is now closer than ever, and the same can be said about a great number of partners, from our eastern partners to ASEAN, from Canada to Japan or Central Asia. I also very much agree on your idea to work on issues-based coalitions of like-minded countries and regional organisations, but also with other global powers. And this idea has already driven our foreign policy in these years, successfully, I believe. Our work on climate change, or the work to preserve the nuclear deal with Iran, are both examples of our readiness to engage selectively and with ad hoc coalitions. I will not go through all the geographical priorities and the current conflicts, but let me just mention 3 points as a matter of priorities. First, the Western Balkans. David, I couldn't agree more with the report. Our common goal is to bring all the Balkans inside the European Union. And we have 2 urgent tasks ahead of us now. Continue to work tirelessly with our friends in Belgrade and Pristina so that they can reach a legally binding comprehensive agreement to fully normalise their relations, and we must finally open accession negotiations with Tirana and Skopje. Let me mention 2 other priorities. Ukraine. We will have a specific debate on this later this evening, so I will keep it for later. And the third priority I would mention is the conflicts in the Mediterranean, and in particular Syria, Yemen, and by the way, the beginning of a dialogue on Yemen and with the Yemenis parties in Sweden is also part of the diplomatic work we have done to bring some of these parties to the table, but also Libya and the conflict in Israel and Palestine. I believe the European Union continues to have a unique, even though difficult, role to play, and I am sure that we will continue to work together to support a sustainable political solution to each one of these crises. Now, the McAllister report underlines that we Europeans have an unparalleled potential as a force for peace and security with a unique set of foreign policy tools. And in these years, we have invested to strengthen and to multiply these tools. And our work on security and defence is not a separate chapter from this. It has been constantly part of this broader engagement for peace, security and human development. I would like once again to be very clear on this, as you have been, David. Our work on security and defence is not a way to militarise our union and will never be. It is not at all in contradiction with our work for non-proliferation and disarmament, for instance. On the contrary, as you all know, we are engaged on a daily basis against nuclear proliferation, but also to prevent new arms races here in Europe and all around the world. Our work on defence stays true to this approach. There is a unique European way to security and defence, a way that is very much needed in the world of today, that is very much appreciated and of which I see a lot of demand. We have somehow a responsibility of exercising this special European way to peace and security. When we send a military mission abroad, it is to save lives, it is to protect peace or to help rebuild a country. When we invest in military capabilities, it is to defend our citizens from attacks or to put the best technologies to the service of peace. Yes, we are investing in Europe's hard power, finally, and we would all prefer that we lived in a world where this was not necessary, but our work on defence is always, always and will always be at the service of peace. This is why it is so important to strengthen it these times. It is also for this reason that I wanted a new compact on civilian missions to be an integral part of our work on a Europe of defence. I talked about this in this hemicycle exactly 1 year ago, and last month the Council has approved our civilian CSDP compact. The civilian dimension of our international missions is already today a European pride, from Mali to Ukraine, from Iraq to Somalia. We now want to expand our civilian action even more, with new capacities and shorter reaction time. The Pascu report calls for closer cooperation between our civilian and military initiatives. I totally agree with this, and it is one of the goals that we want to achieve with the civilian compact and with the reform of our command structures in Brussels. Our two command centres, civilian and military, will work now more closely together. On the military side, our command centre should be ready by 2020 to also run small-scale executive operations, so going beyond what it is doing now, which is commanding training and advisory missions. Last month, together with Member States, we also decided to double the number of cooperation projects in the framework of the Permanent Structured Cooperation in Defence, from 17 to 34. The new projects cover many capabilities that we collectively need, from drones to a European School of Intelligence, from cybersecurity to aerospace. By investing together, we will invest our resources more efficiently and we will make it easier for national defence forces to work together. So in the coming weeks, we will also finalise the general conditions for third states to be exceptionally invited to join PESCO projects. The Pascu report asks to move forward also on military mobility, and as you know, work is ongoing well through a project within the Permanent Structured Cooperation, but also at the European Defence Agency and in full coordination with NATO. Let me add that this is not an investment done at the expense of civilian projects, but on the contrary, a clear dual-use investment. One of the main goals of all our work on security and defence is to help Member States spend their resources more effectively. It is not up to the European Union to define how much of the national budgets is spent on defence, but we can help Member States invest more efficiently, better. We can have an impact on the output of the investments. That is to say that with the same investment we will be able to achieve more for our citizens' security. And this is also the objective of the coordinated annual review of national defence budgets. We have concluded its trial run and the review will become a standing activity as of next year. This will help coordinate defence planning among national governments to find new opportunities for cooperation and joint investments. Finally, in support of this work, we have proposed a very substantive defence package for the next multiannual financial framework. We want to address the fragmentation that has hampered Europe's defence sector for decades. Again, to make national defence investments more effective and efficient than they are today. And I am particularly glad that the Pascu report supports my proposal to establish a European peace facility. Our goal is to be more strategic in how we plan our missions and to work more closely with our partners to prevent new crises or to stabilise a country after a conflict. The facility would fully respect the legal parameters provided by the treaty, and it would avoid duplications with its existing instruments, as demanded by your report. We all acknowledge the fact that security today is much more complex than it ever was. It is military, but it is also civilian. It is about defence, but also it's about development, artificial intelligence, climate change. It is crisis management and also reconciliation. It is about our own capabilities, but it also requires that we work to strengthen our partners and their capabilities around the world. I believe the two reports we discussed today highlight this very well. There is no contradiction between investing in Europe's strategic autonomy and cooperating even more closely with our partners. On the contrary, we Europeans are taking more responsibility for our own security and for the world around us, and we are doing this together with the United Nations, together with NATO, together with the African Union, with all our partners around the world. Rather than discussing whether we have to choose between strategic autonomy or cooperation, I would say that we have chosen the path of cooperative autonomy. And we have taken this path together, joining forces among the Council, the Commission, all our agencies, and of course the European Parliament that has accompanied this process from the very beginning. And I think this is a legacy that you can share with the Council and the Commission as the mandate comes to an end. We still have a few months of common work ahead of us. They will be important months for many of the issues we have discussed. So my appeal to you is that we can still continue our fruitful cooperation and make the most of these few months ahead of us. Let me thank you again for all the cooperation and all the support on these 4 years of work together in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mogherini. Committee on Constitutional Affairs, Mr. Rangel, 1 minute.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Naturalmente, em nome da Comissão de Assuntos Constitucionais.
Now, on behalf of the Committee on Constitutional Affairs, we do indeed greet the work that has been done by Mr. McAllister and Mr. Pascu, and of course what Madam Mogherini has said is extremely valuable. I think it's very, very important to provide to the European Defence Fund. The structure, it has to become a permanent one, it has to be well funded, and let's not forget that this is the result of intensive work, and it is a very, very important fruit that has come out of this particular work that's been done. And this is a major step forward. Also, a military system, a structure which would provide for a civilian, in other words, that compact, that civilian CSDP compact, this is extremely important as well. Also, I think it's extremely important that there be a Council of Ministers of Defense presided over by Madam Mogherini, and also a body here within the Parliament, or a structure here within the Parliament, which would provide.
Mr. Danjean, 1 minute.
Comme l'ont souligné David McAllister.
As Mr. Pascu and Mr. McAllister have already emphasised, we are in a period of complete flux in the international order. It seemed natural, automatic that Europe should finally start to be looking at security. We're not there yet, but there is progress. But we do have a number of obstacles in front of us still. One is the belief that other people will continue to deal with our security through NATO. It's an organisation which has a great deal of merits, but we can't entirely rely on our alliances there. And of course, we have to be responsible for crisis management in our region. I also believe that the declarations of some European leaders, for example Mr. Macron, doesn't help with pragmatic progress towards a common defence policy. A common defence policy is going to require a great deal of effort. So I think we need to be aware of this, and Mr. Pascu's report does explore the right areas. I think we're going in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Danjean. 2 minutes now, Mr. Fleckenstein.
but now. Herr Vizepräsident, Frau Mogherini.
Vice President, Mrs. Mogherini, colleagues, we too, as a political group, would like to extend thanks to both rapporteurs, although in my contribution to this debate I'll be looking more specifically at the McAllister report, because I was shadow rapporteur for that particular text, so I've worked on that one specifically. The report has a clear message. We have challenges in this modern age, threats to Europe, and that's why we need stronger diplomatic answers from Europe. And we also need to stand united in our responses. That also includes a more rapid decision-making process. That's why we need to move on to qualified majority voting in Council. That's what we're calling for, in particular when it comes to civilian EU missions or when it comes to human rights. Europe needs a stronger and a better and more coordinated foreign policy. Now, I hasten to add, this is not a criticism of our High Representative, not at all. It is a call, an appeal to our Member States to encourage them to work further in this direction. One of the reasons for that is crystal clear. The USA, over the course of the last few months, have decided to turn their back on the multilateral world order several times. For instance, when it comes to the Iran agreement, deciding to withdraw from that. And this is, of course, something that is of great interest for our security in Europe. We're trying to promote and maintain commonalities. Nevertheless, we need to take note of the fact that the US President has shifted from being a guarantor of security for Europe, could actually become a risk for our security. And for that reason, there can only be one answer on our part, namely a united Europe and an effective form of multilateralism. We're not just talking about soft power here. We also need to look at hard power. We need to do more than we have done hitherto. It would be naive to claim that you can use soft power alone in order to resolve the problems of our age. A final comment, if I may. There's an amendment which we've tabled because we felt that the situation in Yemen needed to be addressed. Mr. Wieland interrupts. Mr. Fleckenstein, thank you very much for your statement. I now call for 1 minute, Mr. Tannock.
Madam High Rep,
Mr. Tannock is the next speaker.
Madam High Rep, the McAllister report seeks to examine the very difficult foreign and security choices that lie ahead for Europe at a time of real authoritarian threats to the multilateral rules-based post-World War II order. By 2050, Europe will constitute a much smaller part of the world's population, economy and military prowess, and Brexit tragically removes a big player from the EU security equation, weakening both parties. Therefore, in future, the EU needs to act together in projecting its external policies, but of course there are real national sovereignty concerns about moving towards QMV in CFSP and CSDP. Nevertheless, I personally strongly support the EU priorities like maintaining the JCPOA after US withdrawal, containing Russian expansionism, understanding Chinese global ambitions, fighting international terrorism and finding a peaceful solution in Syria and Yemen and making PESCO a political reality. I also welcome some of the innovative thinking in foreign security policy from President Macron and Chancellor Merkel for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tannock. Next speaker, Mr. Pint, 1 minute.
Head kolleegid, on selge, et Euroopa...
Colleagues, it is clear that Europe must do a lot more to protect its security, its defense. We have to do it together with NATO in order to avoid duplication or competition. We should also cooperate with the United States of America. It's also important for the future of Europe. In this systematic cooperation, we have to include those countries that are not in NATO, like Finland and Sweden and other European Union countries. It is also important that the European Union also recognizes new threats like cyber threat, hybrid threats, like fake news campaigns that are manipulated in different societies in Europe. This is all against the cooperation in Europe. We should continue the fight against terrorism, and we should also think about what happened in Crimea a couple of years ago. All in all, We should do much more to protect our security, to protect our defense, but we shouldn't do it in an isolated way, but together with NATO and all others, our allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pite. Next speaker, Mrs. Lösing, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. A lot, in fact, is of great concern in the world. First, for example, 1/4 of the world lives in very unstable countries. So we have to find out living and defense, military as well, is part of this issue. But we ought to ask a number of questions with regard to this. Doesn't it help? Does it help to arm people? Because when you arm people, then they'll use it, and others have to be armed as well. We have to understand this is an economic policy. This is an economic policy, but where is the justice in this? Unfortunately, the two reports are of a different philosophy, different logic, that is to say, militarization rather than in other words, militarization and creating that balance, or supposedly creating that balance between peace and war. PESCO, the various aspects, the various compacts of the CSDP, these are all very, very questionable issues. According to A.2 of the treaties, what we have here is a violation. Because a violation here, according to this particular article, is that the deployment of military forces or military solutions to issues are not the way to go. So I think, indeed, we have to take this into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lösing.
Dialoge ohne Mikrofon.
I'm afraid dialogues conducted off mic will not be, well, nobody will be privy to them, I'm afraid. Mrs. Valero, 1 minute, please. Thank you very much, President. I would like to speak about the annual report on our common foreign security and defence policy, which I've been following on behalf of my group. It's not very balanced, I'm afraid. In fact, whenever we talk about defence and security, when we talk about this in Parliament, that tends to be the case, and also the long-term budget. Not balanced. The annual report really completely disregards the fact that civilian efforts are just as important, and in fact more important than militarised ones. We have to remember the civilian efforts that we make. Now, in this annual report, the focus is really on military aspects, but although there are twice as many civilian interventions. Of course, we have threats, military, environmental, cyber threats, natural disasters. These are just some examples of threats that we're facing, but we can't resolve all of these using military means or with a 2% target in our budget. No, we need a new security policy, one that's actually up to speed with the 21st century, a security policy that talks about human security first and foremost. And what we're here looking at is trying to increase resources for civilian efforts. That's our motion for amendment. And we also want to make sure that civilian efforts aren't used in order to stop migrants in future. I hope to get support for our amendments tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Valero. The next speaker, Mr. Schaffhauser, 1 minute.
My colleague, Mr. McAllister, you say that Europe wants to become a sovereign power, but if you look at the Lisbon Treaty, our sovereignty is already limited there, as it was in the former Soviet Union. Here it's done by the EU foreign policy and NATO, systematic opening up to finance and merchants who are allowed to govern and decide. There is no such thing as European sovereignty without a European people, and so it's an illusion, because I don't know European people, only Germans, French and Italians, and what brings us together in our differences is our Christianity, which the European Union is trying to deny now through its relativism, its secularism and its atheism. My colleague Mr. Pascu says that the European Union should have a common policy to strengthen the European identity, and you threaten us with the spectre of Russia. But they only found their European identity when they left communism and embraced their Orthodox heritage. You're pushing us to war against Russia, to unite us in the West, to try and unite us in our European identity. But the identity is made up of the two sides of Europe together with Russia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schaffhauser. 1 minute, Mr. Carver, please.
These reports underline the EU's truly frightening military aspirations. The description of the European Union as a sovereign entity flies in the face of reality and public opinion, and talk of the projection of power is frankly ludicrous. How can 27 states, some of whom are neutral, ever come to a joint decision to send their young to war? This place must never have the moral ability or authority to order troops into battle. We already have an organisation in NATO that has kept the peace through the most testing times. NATO has the expertise and is an alliance of mutual interest. If you must spend money in this area, then invest in that successful and well-run organisation. And let's leave the UN alone. Your naked ambition for a Security Council seat must not happen. Rather than reforming the EU, you should instead reform your aspirations by remembering the primacy of a nation state. Mr. President, it is a nation state that protects its citizens, and we must ignore this call to arms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carver. 1 minute, Mr. Preda. Thank you very much, President. In the run-up to the EU elections, I think it would be apposite for us to remind EU citizens that our common foreign security and defence policy are not some kind of a second-rate policy, ancillary in nature. No, it has a real impact on our lives. This policy is of fundamental importance for the very future of the EU, and as Mr. McAllister's report says quite rightly, it's high time for Europe to take its destiny in its own hands and to assume its role as a power on the global stage. Our group has always defended a strong role for Europe on the international stage. We believe it's important to safeguard our interests and also to promote the values which are the basis for our very existence. Unity, coherence, the efficiency of the Union in our foreign policy and security policy of paramount importance. We also need greater coordination between our member states, and we need to make sure that we have the financial resources that we need for this purpose. Finally, I would like to mention the Western Balkans and our neighbourhood area. This is a major political priority as I see it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Preda. Next speaker, Mr. Boştinaru. 1 minute.
Mr. President, Madam High Representative, dear colleagues. In today's world, all what seemed to be a certainty not long ago is not anymore. The European Union means peace, but peace needs the tools to guarantee it. We are finally moving in the right direction with the PESCO, and I strongly advocate also for the adoption of the provisions on the European Defence Fund and on the defence mobility for the next MFF. But no doubts that we need more. The EU needs a strategic autonomy and the integration of its defence capabilities to face its many challenges, from conventional ones to hybrid and cyber, and to effectively pursue our foreign policy objectives. But I want to be clear that under no circumstances the defence integration should be seen as an alternative to NATO. NATO is fundamental for the protection of the EU and for the protection of the European citizens today, and I think it will be tomorrow. We must rather reinforce and complement it in the line with the EU-NATO declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boştinaru. Next speaker, Mr. Van Orden.
Mr. President, legitimate concerns about military capabilities are not resolved by the Europeanisation of defence, which is an aspect of the process of European political integration. Mr. President, that was my second speech in the Parliament in November 1999 that I issued that warning. At the time, people said this was just scaremongering, or else I was told it was never going to happen. Now, Mr. McAllister calls for removal of the national veto in foreign policy, and Mr. Pascu's report at least has the sense to refer to NATO and the need for more investment in defence, but its main thrust is EU strategic autonomy, the so-called EU defence industry, and the development of PESCO, in other words, advancing an EU army. An EU army, what's wrong with it? It wastes resources, it sends the wrong signals, it's divisive, and it pretends the world is flat, that it's possible to increase the scope and efficiency of defence spending without increasing defence spending itself. It will end in tears.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Orden. Next speaker, Mr. Radoš, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Mrs. High Representative, I would like to thank colleagues Paşcu and McAllister for very good cooperation and a very good report that mentions a whole series of new challenges that the European Union needs to face. And we will most probably have to face these same challenges in the years to come. That is why it is very logical that we have developed some policies, including this within this common policy, and that we are for the European Defence Agency, for the military mobility, and the defence programme, or for the multi-annual financial framework. What still remains to be determined is how these policies are going to function, because we have to see what practical results they will yield, and what does the hard or sharp force of the European Union really mean, which is mentioned in these reports.
Thank you, Mr. Radoš. Next speaker, 1 minute, Mr. Papadakis.
The militarization of the European Union is a prophecy of doom, with people suffering on the altar of imperialism, and the European Union simply being accomplice in this entire issue. These various quick mobility forces are an indication that Europe is moving towards militarization, essentially, and of course Europe in cooperation with other imperialists in order to expand monopolies, getting rid of any sort of a system where there are many voices in external policy, reducing everything to a single common denominator. That of militarization is totally unacceptable. This is the policy of the United States, of NATO, and other similar such structures. Numerous countries have suffered. My country has suffered as a result of imperialist wars, and many others as well, and many to come, it appears. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Papadakis. Next speaker, Mr. Brok, 1 minute. President, High Representative, colleagues. The European Union is the most important soft power in the world. 60% of development aid, 7% of humanitarian aid for the Middle East and Near East. It's evidence to that effect. But we're seeing that that is not sufficient in itself. If soft power doesn't go hand in hand with hard power, then I'm afraid soft power only has limited effect. And that's why I would like to thank both rapporteurs. Thank you for presenting your points as well as you did. And we need to be stronger, more qualified majority voting, more leadership, coalition of the willing, in order to reach decisions more quickly. And in addition to that, when it comes to the Defence Union and what we did last December, we need to, I think, now make sure that we have the financial resources accompanying that, and Member States need to be encouraged to do this. The Defence Fund, the Defence Union, we can do everything that we need to, but it's going very slowly because so much is spent in Europe on defence, but the results are insufficient. Finally, Mrs. Lösing would like to perhaps see Russian tanks rolling in. Mr. Schaffhauser is talking about Christianity. I'm afraid those are not valid points. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Brok. Mrs. Gomes, 1 minute.
Na sua comissão de sede desde 2004 vi avançar com a hesitação.
We have been discussing CFSP and CSDP for a number of years now. But at the moment we can see that the challenges we're facing have increased. We have more digitalization, we have Putin's trolls who have financed the extreme right, Trump, Brexit. We're seeing a rejection of multilateralism, and now member states are facing an increasing number of threats. So we need to have an integrated European Union policy in order to ensure more interoperability and to focus European investment in research and technology. Of course, that has to be under the democratic scrutiny of member states and our parliament, who will respect peace and the rule of law in Europe. The member states here have to face the threat of cyber threats in particular, and threats to our energy infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr. Vistisen, 1 minute. What we're hearing today, namely the Commission's vision and Parliament's vision concerning our future common foreign security and defence policy, it gives me the shudders, I must say. We're talking about qualified majority voting. We're talking about also strategic measures, which would mean that in future we would no longer be allies or friends with, for instance, our colleague in NATO, USA, Canada. We'd actually be autonomous. We'd be completely alone in the world. And from a Danish perspective, I think that the most alarming thing is the left position on this. I think it's important for us to really speak out against this. From a Danish perspective, that's what we're doing. We believe that there should be better coordination, and I think it's really ridiculous to see what we're witnessing here in this Parliament, the positions that are being defended here, you know, autonomy vis-à-vis our NATO allies. No. Denmark's response would be, you know, do you really want this for the EU or not? Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Vistisen. The next speaker, 1 minute, Mr. Sosniets.
The European has been walking around this issue of having a common army for a while now, and you can see these tendencies in these reports. Well, it's not mentioned directly, but we see that there is progress in the matter. Right now the EU wants to compete with NATO, and there is talk about synergies, but actually it is a conflict, because it's a conflict of loyalty. If NATO and the EU were to take opposed actions, member states will have to choose who to follow. So this is a very dangerous rule, and it's obvious that the EU does not respect the sovereignty of member states right now. What will happen when it will have tanks? Right now it doesn't have any tanks, so it may potentially threaten a member state with sanctions or kick it out of the EU. Let's remember that the Charter of Fundamental Rights is above the law, according to some, so I am against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sosniets. Next speaker, 1 minute, Mr. Gahler. Thank you very much. Thank you, President. I will concentrate on the report by Mr. Paşcu, Common Security and Defence Policy, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him for good cooperation. As a Parliament, we can be proud. We've not just been there for this process, we've really pushed for this process over the course of the last year or two. Everything that's been developed, we've been right behind it in terms of our common security and defence policy, and we would like to give support to the proposals made by the High Representative in this regard, and I welcome the fact that we can see this military planning and conduct capability, the fact that we're going to be rolling this out for 2020, and this isn't just a question of training or education, it's also executive missions, that too will be included. So you can see with these kinds of developments, it's step by step. I welcome that. I welcome the European Peace Facility as well, which is in the pipeline. I think that that will allow us to make sure that in third parties, in third countries, we are able to give support to those who do not want us to appear there in person on the ground. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Gahler. The next speaker for a minute, Mr. Synadinos.
Με την εφαρμογή της κοινής πολιτικής ασφάλειας.
Now, with the implementation of the CSDP, it is not possible to deal with current and existing threats. The member states either have conflicting priorities or don't have the necessary resources. Of course, convergence between countries and their allies is absolutely necessary since we face the same challenges. However, we have to make sure that we don't confuse having too much of a federation. A military partnership for collective defense will not exist if we don't have a clarity when it comes to the EU role and what the role of the member states. And we cannot have collective defense if, in the case of a member state being attacked by a third country, we want to make sure that it's not about the interests of the member states that are not along the external borders of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sinadin. The next speaker, Mr. Salafranca, of 1 minute. President, Madam High Representative, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, my congratulations to the rapporteurs, Mr. McAllister and Mr. Pascu. The credibility of the EU CFSP and indeed the safeguard of our principles is in large part going to depend on our ability to have the necessary tools to flesh out our soft powers, Mr. McAllister pointed out, so that we can meet the security expectations of citizens. In recent years, we've made a lot of progress in the common strategy. We found our own autonomy. We found a cooperation with member states with structured cooperation and with our allies within NATO. We launched the European Defence Fund and the European Peace Fund. We're clearly on the right track, and there are good reasons to be satisfied, but there's a great deal yet to be done. Madam High Representative, carry on along these lines and work on the decision-making mechanisms. Our allies can take decisions overnight, but we are blocked by the unanimity principle, and obviously we need to make progress in doing things more expeditiously as required while the time frame. Thank you, Mr. Salafranca. The next speaker, Mr. Kukan.
Thank you very much. Thanks and congratulations to the rapporteurs. This year showed once again that we stand before many challenges in the international scene. Yet we can barely fulfill our ambitions if we do not have control over our closest neighbourhood. This concerns our strategies and actions in eastern and southern neighbourhood, but also our relations and influence on the countries of the Western Balkans. It's imperative for the EU to be surrounded by stable and like-minded partners. We need to stand behind the values of democracy, rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms in the core of our external policies. Being it in the Balkans, where the situation might deteriorate, being it in our eastern neighbourhood, where the situation is already tense, or being it in the south, where we are facing constant challenges. We need to bring more credibility and confidence in our EU external policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kukan. The next speaker, Mr. Kelam.
Faced with global challenges, the existing EU policies remain clearly inadequate. This is high time to realize, but the formidable task remains to develop really new policies to address the multiple challenges. Doing this, we cannot dismiss one crucial fact. Our security is and will be based primarily on transatlantic relationship. Therefore, we need to be careful not to overreact to temporary changes and not to undermine the strategic balance on which our collective security is being built. Key is to focus on strategic priorities, and I would just mention 2 of them. First, to enforce and fully integrate the STRATCOM unit. Second, military mobility adopted today by the Parliament will become a reality check for our commitment to credible mutual assistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kelam. The next speaker, Mr. Mian Mon, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. The European Union finds itself in a very complex external affairs environment. And there are certain intra-state conflicts, failed states, terrorism, violations of international law, and a whole series of problems. And we've seen that the rules-based order and multilateralism are being questioned ever more. I think when it comes to just sitting back and doing nothing and being inactive. That doesn't make any sense at all. We as Europeans have to be active on the international stage, and we need a European external foreign policy which is efficient and steadfast. And I think I can support Mr. McAllister's report because it does include a lot of detailed information on the common security and foreign policy as well, which is included in Mr. Pascu's report. I'd like to congratulate Mr. McAllister, and I think he is listening to me now. His report refers to neighbourhood policy and transatlantic relations. There are those countries to the south of the Mediterranean which are very important to the European Union. He refers to those. He also refers to relations with Latin American countries who are the natural allies of the European Union. And I would very much hope that the Mercosur negotiations come to a speedy close.
Thank you, Mr. Miyamon. We now move on to the catch-the-eye procedure. I have more requests than that can be allowed on the agenda, so I would ask for your understanding if I can't give you the floor. The first speaker will be Mr. Zdrojewski.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could start off with a critical element. We have two major reports which have been joined together in a joint debate. Turning to Mr. McAllister and Mr. Pascu, I can only sympathise with you, because trying to deal with all these complex issues in one single debate is not ideal. But I think there's one key element, and that is the content of these reports. During the course of this afternoon's debate, we've taken a look at a diagnosis, i.e. the European Union strategic environment. Then we've taken a look at finance, and we have the common security and defence policy, common security and foreign policy, and looking at capabilities of the European Union, and obviously we want to defend the defence sector, look at the industry in the sector as well. But then, of course, there are the different operations within the context of these joint policies, and the kind of things we want to do with our partners. So it's almost far too much to deal with in one single debate, but I'd like to congratulate our rapporteurs.
Thank you, Mr. Zdrojewski. Mr. Leeds.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident!
Mr. President, tomorrow I'm going to vote against this yearly report on the implementation of the Common Foreign Security Defence Policy, and I'm going to vote against the Defence Fund. This has been welcomed this year. Nonetheless, why? Well, as a German Social Democrat, I'm against the principle of there being a European army for a peace-oriented foreign policy. That's essential, but that means we need a European armaments industry, and this has to genuinely respect the pooling and sharing principle. For Social Democrats, it means that we've got to look at the real objectives, and there's got to be real cooperations, and which will lead to real budget savings. And that means we need a process of conversion of civil and defence purposes. There isn't insufficient parliamentary scrutiny on this, and what it has in the report is insufficient. Thank you very much, Mr. Leeds. Next speaker, Mr. Jurek.
Thank you. An institution should be created and set up for policies and not just for empty talking. And Mr. Fleckenstein has already said that in the United States, we can see that a lot of things are unforeseeable, but we've seen that 1/4 of the member states in the European Union, particularly towards the east of the European Union, we have the Nord Stream 2 project, which is very destructive for those countries in that part of the European Union. I'm very interested to see what Mr. Fleckenstein has to say on this, because this is a project that is going to be continued to be built. And this week, the Committee of Regions, who represents our local governments across the European Union, has said that this is a project that is threatening the strategic energy policy of the European Union. It's very dangerous in environmental terms, and it undermines and harms the interests of certain countries. And I think we really ought to think about just what our security is. So think about it first and then build up on that.
Thank you, Mr. Jurek. Mr. Kozo Permuy, please.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Mrs. Mogherini. When we look at these two reports, we'll realize that they contain original sin at a time when we have lost our compass here in the EU and we are disintegrating. I'm talking about defense and the sacrosanct transatlantic bond. What this does is looking at the EU and the strategic autonomy. The US isn't interested in a strong EU with its own voice and good neighborly relations. We see examples every day. We have differences on climate, relations with Iran and China. If you look at the military field, the same there. We have to listen to what NATO says, 2% that just line the pockets of the arms industry, and a policy, military mobility that goes against this. And this is just another piece of this puzzle in the disintegration of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kozo Permuy. Mrs. Zojfko now.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank Mr. McAllister and Mr. Pashko and the High Representative for representing the priorities in the European Common Foreign and Security Policy, and I think that this is an excellent report, and we've heard also an excellent speech from the High Representative. Let me just draw your attention to what is happening at the eastern and southern borders of the European Union. I am thinking especially of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where it is difficult to form governments at all levels due to the current crisis. The European Union and Ms. Mogherini especially should make efforts and involve also other global actors to find a middle way, a neutral stance, and establish peace in that part of Europe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mrs. Zovko. The last catch the eye speaker is Mr. Lopez.
Thank you very much. High Representative, today we're talking about our common security and defense policy and a common foreign and security policy, because the EU has to face a more hostile world, and that is speaking a language that we're not so used to, a more hostile world, and transatlantic relations are no longer as reliable as before, and problems with neighboring countries, and then a situation in Asia that could change everything. And again, a power game that we're not used to between the big powers. We need better cooperation in defense in order to get strategic autonomy, in order to have a strong position that will help us defend our values, so that we can flank, so that this can go hand in hand with our soft power when it comes to diplomacy and trade. We have to be able to do this. We have to be flexible. We have to be independent and autonomous so that we can defend our interests and values around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. That concludes the Catch the Eye procedure. To conclude the debate, we'll hear again from the High Representative for Common Foreign Security Policy and Vice President of the Commission, Ms. Mogherini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be brief. First of all, to stress the fact that it is exactly to strengthen the autonomy but also a cooperative autonomy that the Union has on foreign and security and defence policy that we have done together with the support of the European Parliament in these last couple of years. Big work on the Europe of security and defence and on strengthening our global role. Exactly in a moment where, when the world is looking towards the European Union, looking at us in search for leadership in many different fields. We feel the responsibility, I think rightly so, to respond to this demand in a positive manner. It's a demand from our citizens, it's a demand from our partners. I would like only to underline 3 points. First, some of you mentioned the issue of human security, and this is as a principle guiding our action. I fully agree. For us, security is never purely a military concept. The European way to peace and security is a way that comes from our history. We know perfectly well that there is no threat, no challenge, no crisis that can be addressed only through military means. Sometimes they are needed, and this is why we are working on strengthening our defence work, but no threat can be addressed only with military means alone. This is why we are strengthening our civilian and military cooperation in a way that has never been done before. Second point I would like to underline, it is not by coincidence that strengthening as never before the European Union work on security and defence has gone hand in hand in these last years with strengthening of EU-NATO cooperation. It is exactly because we believe that strategic autonomy doesn't mean going it alone, but it means strengthening cooperation with our partners, starting from NATO, but also with the United Nations and other regional organisations that for us are key partners and allies. Third point I would like to underline that came up in the debate, on the Europe of security and defence, now in this still few months of work this Parliament has in front of you, I think we have some relevant work to be done. First of all, consolidating the work that has been done so far on security and defence, and secondly, ensuring that there are adequate financial resources and instruments to sustain the work that has been envisaged so far. Finally, let me thank the two rapporteurs, McAllister and Paşcu, and sincerely thanking the European Parliament for the support and the impulse it has given to our work on this field, foreign security and defence policy. Without the support and the inputs of the Parliament, we would probably have not got so far in this common work we've had, so a sincere thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mogherini. And to conclude the debate, I'll give the floor to both rapporteurs, 2 minutes each. First up, Mr. McAllister.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, I listened very carefully to what you had to say, and I would like to thank all for an open and honest debate. Especially a thanks go to the shadow rapporteurs and the speakers of the groups, but also to the High Representative for her very constructive cooperation, her clear words, and in general I would like to really thank you, Federica Mogherini, on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the good cooperation we enjoy. I would like to make one remark, and this is also about what the High Representative had to say at the end of the debate. This is the last CFSP report in this term. However, a lot of work lies ahead of us, in particular the ongoing negotiations of the next multi-annual financial framework. And I believe that in this next MMF, adequate financial resources should be made available for our Union's external action, because this is a direct investment in the security of our continent. And in these upcoming negotiations, we don't only have to ensure adequate financing, but also the coherence, the effectiveness, the responsiveness and the flexibility of our external financing instruments. And most importantly, we shouldn't get tired of stressing the need to adequately involve our Parliament in the scrutiny and in the strategic steering of these instruments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. McAllister. The next speaker is Mr. Paşcu.
I would also like to thank you very much, Federica, for all the support which we have given, we were receiving. I would also like to thank all my colleagues, the shadow rapporteurs who have been supportive. I think you know that it is evident that we live in interesting times. And I'm very happy for those who believe that we can still afford conversion, disarmament and these good things But I am afraid, that we are beyond that, and we have to really continue what we have started to do. We are moving in the right direction. Perhaps the pace is not, shall we say, the most appropriate, but we are moving in the right direction. And I am convinced that our colleagues who would follow us in this Parliament would continue our work. It will probably be more difficult to get the acceptance, but I am sure that if they are really conscious enough, they will push in the direction which has already been started. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Paşcu.
Thank you, Mr. Paşcu. That concludes this debate. The vote will take place tomorrow. The next item on the agenda is the report by our colleague Mr. Auštrevičius, Annual Report on Human Rights and Democracy in the World in 2017 and the European Union's policy on this matter. The first speaker will be Mr. Auštrevičius.